Welcome back to Research Methods and Statistics paper. So far you have learned about the basics of research. Now we will talk about specifics. What is quantitative research methods? Okay. Here you will be introduced to quantitative research methods and basic techniques of quantitative research methods. At the end of this session, you would have learned the types of quantitative research methods, advantages and challenges when using quantitative methods, and situations where quantitative methods are most appropriate. So first of all, let us understand what exactly we mean by quantitative research. Quantitative research involves the use of empirical methods to investigate a particular issue or a social phenomena or a research question. Data that is collected is either numeric or such that it can be easily converted into numeric values, and you analyze it by using relevant statistic methods or techniques. Quantitative research is defined in advance, and the methodology and the study design is completed before you start out the research. Okay. Researchers who use quantitative research methods start with a theory. Okay. They use this theory to examine, analyze and make predictions from the data that they collect so that they can answer the research question. This method is known as a deductive approach. Quantitative methods focus on numbers and so are ideal for answering certain types of questions. For example, what is the percentage of students who complete vocational training and they find gainful employment within a year? How many children who complete primary school education enter secondary school? Or what is the difference between the average 10th standard student in public school and in private schools? All these answers are in numeric, in numbers. Okay. Alternatively, you could have a range and convert that to numbers. What do we mean by this? Let us consider an example. Let us assume that we want to understand the attitudes of adolescent girls towards the practice of dowry. We want to use a survey method. We want to do a quantitative research. So how are we going to do this? We could prepare a bunch of statements, say 5 statements, and give a scale to assess their attitude. The first statement could be something like, dowry system is a social evil in India, and the respondent has to say whether they strongly agree, neither agree nor disagree or is unsure, disagree or strongly disagree. You have numerical values of 1 to 5 which you can consolidate and use to analyze the data. For example, you could say 78% of the respondents strongly agreed with the statement, while 2% strongly disagreed, and the rest would fit into either unsure or agree or disagree. You can also do this in another way. You can calculate the actual range of score by multiplying the lowest and the highest scores possible. For example, 1 into 5. Here you have 5 statements. So it will be 1 into 5 for each of the statements and 5 into 5 for all 25 statements, and you could calculate it based on that. We can even use a suitable class interval to identify the degree of variation in attitude. Here you can make 3 class intervals within the range of 5 to 25, because you have 5 statements and 5 respondents into 5 statements, which is 25. So you could say that 5 to 11 represents strong negative views on dowry, 12 to 18 represent moderate negative views, and 9 to 25 represent strong positive views on the issue. Once you finished analysis, you could say 68% or 78% or whatever percent of respondents had a strong negative attitude towards the practice of dowry, while 30% had a moderately negative attitude, while only 2% showed a favorable, strongly favorable attitudes towards dowry. So these are 3 methods of analyzing a range or a statistical range of data. Quantitative researchers are very careful about maintaining objectivity towards their research. Okay. They usually point out under what conditions the results hold true and what are the prerequisites to make sure that these results are true. Quantitative research methods are an effective and efficient method of collecting data from large samples. This can be generalized to larger populations. This is used to collect data from large samples and is used for designing policies which can impact on large populations. Quantitative studies are defined and designed in advance, so you can easily replicate them in other multiple situations. They do not change at all. Your design is fixed. Okay. Surveys are a very popular quantitative tool. It's used to collect data from a large sample of population. Surveys are used for collecting census data, predicting election results and collecting demographic data or health related information. Now we come to key terms that are used in quantitative research. Unit. Okay, a unit refers to the people or things on which or from whom we collect data. For example, schools, children, villages, housing societies, communities, etc. Variables are the specific characteristics of the units that we are studying. Okay. For example, your unit is a child. The variable would be gender, age, education. If it is an adult, you could have income as well. Okay. And when you are doing your research, you would look at how two variables are connected. You would study the interlinkages between two variables. The third key term is a sample. Sample is a subset of a population from whom data is collected. So, you have a huge population from whom you are collecting data from some amount of people. That is your sample. In quantitative studies, data from a sample is used to make observations and inferences about the larger population. So, how you select your sample becomes very, very essential. Finally, the fourth important term is a hypothesis. A hypothesis is a statement that links or explains relationship between two or more variables, and that is the basis of your research. Okay? It is testable and it could be stated in sentences like the higher the educational level, the higher the income. Okay? What are your types of quantitative research? There are many types and we are going to do 4 basic types of quantitative research. Okay? The first type is a descriptive research, which, as can be seen from the title, describes or identified variables. It seeks to answer questions that describe certain phenomena. So, it will have questions such as how much, what percentage, how often. It involves collecting data on status of things and using the data to analyze and provide information on the research question. These do not prove relationships or causality between variables. For example, some questions are: what percentage of rag pickers are girls? How often do adolescents use social networks on a monthly basis? How frequently do children employed in home-based factories go to school every month? What is the incidence of cigarette smoking among 18 to 25-year-old Indian youth? Your research could have more than one research question, and it usually does. Okay. Second type of research is the correlation research. Here you are looking at determining the extent to which one or more variables are related to each other. In this, you explore patterns and look for trends in the data. These do not focus on causal relationships between the variables. They do not allow for manipulation of variables. They are used and studied in their existing state. They involve collecting data on status of things, and once again this is used to analyze and provide information on the research question. They do not prove relationships once again. Okay. For example, over here you would look at what is the relationship between volunteering and self-esteem. What is the relationship between smoking and lung cancer? So, you will conclude by saying there is a relationship between smoking and lung cancer, but you will not be able to conclude that smoking leads to lung cancer. Okay. If you want to do that, you need to look at another type of research. The third type of research, this is known as a quasi-experimental research or a cause comparative research. Here you are looking to establish a cause-effect relationship or causal relationship between two or more variables. But this does not involve randomized assignment of subjects in sample or control groups. Okay. Here the focus is on comparing groups that have been exposed to certain treatments with groups that have not been exposed to this treatment. Okay. It does not involve manipulation of independent variable. It is useful where you do not have experimental research, where experimental research is either unethical or impractical. It's similar to but different from experimental research, and that you will understand when we look at experimental research, which is the fourth type of quantitative research. Some example of cause comparative research or quasi-experimental research could be effect of preschool education on primary school completion, effect of smoking on lung cancer, effect of education levels on income, effect of poverty on mental health. Now we go to the last and fourth type of quantitative research, which is experimental research. Here you have an independent variable and a dependent variable. You have an entire module on variables and what variables are, what independent variable is. I think that is module number 9, so you can refer to that for more details on different types of variables. Okay. In an experimental research, independent variable is manipulated to assess its effect on the dependent variable. Okay. Subjects are assigned to experimental groups and control groups, and this assignment is done on a random basis. Okay. However, results that are obtained in a laboratory setting may not be generalized outside, and when you do it in a generalized outside setting, you might have a few issues. You have to be very careful about that. Advantage of this is you can prove causality to an extent that other research designs cannot. This is used increasingly to study relationship between two or more variables, especially when you are trying to see the cause-effect relationship in that. Experimental research is often called true experimentation or gold standard of empirical research. Identified subjects are all identical, and then they are randomly assigned to control and experimental group. The control group will not get the treatment or the intervention that you are planning, while the experimental group will get that. And then you compare the end results from both. You collect the same data and compare it to see how the experimental group has changed because of the intervention, whereas the control group has not had any changes. Advantage of this is that you do away with other variables. Hidden variables, pre-existing characters are done away with, since both your groups have identical respondents. Identical respondents meaning they have no different characteristics. Examples could be effect of classroom teaching and one-on-one teaching on academic grades of children. So you would have one-on-one teaching in one group and classroom teaching in another group. Effect of punishment-free education on children's self-esteem. So you would have an intervention on punishment-free teaching for the experimental group, and the control group would have the normal teaching, and then you would assess self-esteem across both and compare to see is there an effect on the self-esteem because of the intervention, which is a punishment-free education intervention. Experimental research is challenging because the field keeps changing. So to control things is very difficult, and strict control is required to rule out any external factors that might influence your study, which is difficult to obtain in the real world setting. So what you tend to do is you get your control group and your experimental group to a predetermined setting and provide the intervention there where you can control other external factors. Okay. Now, what are the tools you use to conduct quantitative research? Most common tool is the survey tool. Okay. This can be administered over phone, online, mail, in person, or you can ask the participant to self-administer it. So, you do a pre-test kind of thing where everybody does, both the groups do a survey, fill in a survey. Then for your experimental group, you put in your intervention. Then again you use the same kind of survey to collect the information, and then you can do a comparison very clearly, which will show you the impact or the effect of your intervention on the experimental group, and that will help you identify how the relationship works. Advantages of quantitative research. Greatest advantage is you can produce precise data and in great quantities. Okay? You produce data on defined results, because you've already defined the results at the beginning of the study. You know what you're expecting, and you can specify the degree of certainty or probability of the results. Okay. It can be generalized to a larger population. This is very useful when designing policy or program intervention. It permits testing of various hypotheses to verify whether this is true in certain context or not. The data that you get is reliable and very accurate because there is very little researcher bias in this. It can be replicated easily in other contexts or time periods because it is very clearly defined, and this will give a better understanding of a phenomena across different contexts. Analysis involves standardized tests such as standard deviation, t-test. These types of statistics will be explained to you later in other modules. Since the methods of calculation are standard and exactly the same across the world, you can do a comparison across different cultures. Analysis is done very quickly and easily because you can use statistical software for doing this. So, this is non-time consuming. Okay. It is very simple to collect data from large groups because you have a very straightforward survey questionnaire with very few open-ended questions, normally no open-ended questions. Okay. And because of the accuracy and generalizability of the data produced, it is used by policy makers, funders, and by donors. Yet nothing is perfect, and quantitative research also has its limitations, which you need to understand. You cannot get any contextual insights into this because you have a closed-ended tool where nobody can add any other information. So, sometimes factors that influence subjects to think or act in a particular manner might end up being ignored. Your respondents do not have any scope to provide explanations or narrative details in this. So, sometimes you might not get a complete picture of the topic that you are researching upon. Since they are designed to be closed and they are fixed, the design is such that all the responses are already created by the researcher, and so researcher bias might come into question over here. So, one has to be very careful about it, and this could be a limitation of quantitative research. Sometimes quantitative research could prove to be very expensive because you need equivalent subjects which need to be identified, and you might not find them in one area, in which case you will need to pay them to come to your area, so that requires expense. You might also need to create certain settings where you can do away with external variables, which might also require additional expenses. So, when should you use quantitative research? Quantitative research should be used when you require numeric data, when it is necessary to obtain data from different contexts or compare them across different contexts, when there is a hypothesis or a relationship that between two variables that needs to be tested, and in research studies which are going to be used to design policies or interventions for large group of people, where you need to be able to generalize and you need to collect data quickly from large groups of people. But there are situations where you should not use quantitative research, which is when you need to explore people's opinions, in-depth feelings or attitudes on certain issues, not overall attitudes, in which case you can create a scale, but in-depth attitudes. Okay. Quantitative research requires budget, like we mentioned before. So, you need to take that into account when you are deciding whether you need to do a quantitative or a qualitative research. Okay. Now, we have completed an orientation to quantitative research, and we will summarize the key findings. Quantitative research methods are mainly for collection or conversion of data in numeric forms. Statistical tests are used to analyze the data and to explain the phenomena that you are studying. Key terms that we use in quantitative research include units, variables, hypothesis and sample. 4 types of quantitative research are descriptive research, correlational research, comparative or quasi-experimental research and experimental research. Surveys are a commonly used and primary method of data collection in quantitative research. Advantage of quantitative research is that you can collect numeric data from large population in a short time, and this data is generalizable to larger populations. Disadvantage is the tool itself is rigid and cannot be used to explore in-depth attitudes or perceptions. I hope that you have got a good understanding of quantitative research. Thank you for your time.